I needed help. Not money. Not anything complicated. Just one call answered without hesitation. Just one voice that didn't sound like I was interrupting their life. That morning, the house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones and reminds you how alone you really are. The sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds in thin lines across the table I had set out of habit. One plate, one mug, one chair pulled slightly too far from where it used to be when there were more of us. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting on the back of the chair, as if someone might walk in and fill the silence. No one did. I told myself it was nothing serious, just a small problem that anyone could help with. A ride. A little time. Something simple. I reached for my phone, scrolling past old messages that had grown shorter over the years. Fewer words, fewer reasons to call. Jason's name sat there at the top, just like it always had. For a second, I hesitated, not because I doubted he would answer, but because I already knew how the conversation would feel. Still, I pressed call. It rang longer than it used to. Long enough for me to consider hanging up before it connected. When he finally answered, his voice was distracted, like I had caught him in the middle of something more important. "Hey, Mom. What's up?" I could hear movement in the background, the faint echo of another voice. Lauren's, though I couldn't make out the words. I kept my tone steady, light, the way I always had when I didn't want to seem like a burden. I explained what I needed. Just a small favor. Just a little help. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that stretches just enough to say everything without saying anything at all. Yeah, I mean, today's kind of crazy," he said, and I could hear him shifting, already pulling away from the idea. "We've got a lot going on." In the background, Lauren's voice became clearer, a soft interruption, something about schedules, about appointments, about how packed the day was. He repeated it back to me, almost word for word, like it had already been decided before I even called. "Maybe tomorrow," he added, but even. That sounded uncertain, like tomorrow would come with the same answer dressed in different words. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Of course," I said. "I understand." I always understood. That had become my role over the years, to understand, to adjust, to make things easier for everyone else. We ended the call quickly, politely, like two people who didn't quite know what to say to each other anymore. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I set the phone down on the counter and stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to ring again, for him to call back and say he'd changed his mind. It didn't. I moved through the house slowly, picking up small things that didn't need picking up, straightening corners that were already straight. Outside, I could hear a car pass by, then another, the world continuing as if nothing had shifted. But something had. It wasn't the first time I had asked for help. It wasn't even the first time I had been told no, not directly, but through careful words and softer excuses. Still, there was something about this time that settled differently in my chest. Maybe it was the way he hadn't even asked a question. Maybe it was how quickly the answer came, wrapped in reasons that sounded reasonable but felt rehearsed. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that I had started expecting this. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down, the chair creaking slightly under my weight, the same sound it had made for years, only now it echoed louder in the empty space. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the place where Jason used to sit when he was younger, when he would ask for help with things that felt urgent and important in his world. Back then, I never said I was too busy. I never checked with anyone else before answering. I just showed up. That's what you do when it's your child. You show up. I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that doesn't quite release anything. I needed help. And they had excuses. Not cruel ones. Not loud ones. Just enough to remind me exactly where I stood now in their lives. Somewhere between obligation and inconvenience. Somewhere easy to postpone. I reached for my coffee, now lukewarm, and took a small sip, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue a little longer than usual. Then I set the cup down and looked at the phone again, not with hope this time, but with a kind of quiet clarity that hadn't been there before. I did not call him again that morning. I told myself I would wait, that I would give him time, because that is what a good mother does. She does not push. She does not make things harder than they already are. I moved through the rest of the day slowly, almost carefully, as if any sudden motion might break something fragile that I could not quite name. The house stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that hums softly in the background, filling every corner. I found myself listening for sounds that were not there anymore, footsteps on the stairs, the front door opening, a voice calling out from another room. It had been years, and still, sometimes, I expected it. I went about small routines to keep my hands busy. I wiped the same counter twice. I folded a dish towel that did not need folding. I checked the clock more often than necessary, not because I had somewhere to be, but because time felt heavier when there was nothing to interrupt it. Around noon, I glanced at my phone again. No missed calls. No messages. I told myself he was busy, that he would call later, maybe after things settled down. That was always the explanation now. Things would settle later. Later had become a place that never arrived. I stepped outside for a moment, just to feel something different. The air was mild, the kind of early afternoon warmth that used to make me open all the windows when Jason was a boy, letting the breeze carry the sound of his laughter through the house. Back then, he would run in and out without thinking, asking for help with homework, with a broken toy, with something that felt urgent in his small world. I never told him I was too busy. I never told him to try again tomorrow. I just stopped what I was doing and helped. It never felt like a sacrifice. It felt like being needed. I stood there on the porch, watching a neighbor across the street load groceries into the back of her car. She moved. Quickly, efficiently, like someone who had places to be, people waiting. For a moment, I wondered what that felt like now, to be expected somewhere, to have someone counting on you without hesitation. I went back inside and sat down again, this time near the window, the phone resting on the table within reach. I did not pick it up. Not yet. Instead, I let my thoughts drift to the years that had passed so quietly I had barely noticed the change. It had not happened all at once. There was no single moment where everything shifted. It was smaller than that. Subtle. A call returned a little later than usual. A visit shortened because something else came up. A conversation that felt rushed, like I was fitting into a space instead of belonging there. And then Lauren came into the picture, and things became more structured, more scheduled, more managed. She was always polite, always smiling, but there was a firmness underneath it, something that set boundaries I had not realized were being drawn. I adjusted like I always did. I told myself it was normal, that life changes, that children grow up and build their own routines. I never wanted to be the kind of mother who made things difficult. So I stepped back, little by little, until stepping back became my place. The afternoon stretched on, and eventually I gave in and picked up the phone again. I did not call this time. I opened the messages instead, scrolling through the last few weeks. Short replies, simple updates, nothing that asked how I was doing in a way that waited for an honest answer. I started to type something, then stopped. I erased it. There was no point in asking again, not when I already knew what the answer would sound like. Not when I could already hear the pause before it came. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. It was not anger that settled in me. It was something quieter than that, something clearer. I began to understand that what I had been holding on to was not what things were anymore, but what they used to be. And the difference between those two had grown wider than I had allowed myself to see. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again. At the familiar furniture, the photographs on the wall, the small details that had once made this place feel full. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I needed help. And somewhere along the way, asking for it had become an inconvenience I was expected to manage on my own. I did not expect the truth to come all at once. It came in pieces, quiet and ordinary, the way most things do when you are not looking for them. Later that afternoon, I picked up my phone again, not to call Jason this time, but simply to pass the time, scrolling through things that did not really matter. That is when I saw it. A photo. Bright, polished, carefully framed. Jason was there, standing beside Lauren, both of them smiling in that effortless way people do when they have nowhere else to be. The caption mentioned a lunch, something casual, something planned. I looked closer. It was not just the two of them. There were others at the table, friends, laughter caught mid-moment, glasses raised slightly as if someone had just said something amusing. The timestamp was from earlier that day, around the same time I had called. I stared at the image longer than I should have, my eyes tracing the details, the way Jason leaned back in his chair, relaxed, unhurried, the way Lauren sat beside him, perfectly composed, as if everything in their world was exactly where it should be. There was no rush in that photo, no sense of a day too busy to spare even an hour. I did not feel anger at first, just a quiet recognition. The kind that settles slowly, like dust in a room that has not been opened in a while. I set the phone down carefully, almost gently, as if it might shatter if I handled it too quickly. Then I picked it up again, just to make sure I had not misunderstood. The image was still there. The smiles were still there. The timestamp had not changed. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It was not about the lunch. It was not about where they were or who they were with. It was about the space I no longer occupied in their decisions. The space I had quietly been moved out of, without ever being told directly. I thought back to the call, to the pause in Jason's voice, to the way he had said the day was full. It had been full, just not with anything that included me. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, past the living room, past the hallway where photographs lined the walls. There was one of Jason as a child, missing his front teeth, holding up a drawing he had insisted I hang on the refrigerator for weeks. There was another from his high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling in a way that felt easy and certain. I stopped there for a moment, looking at that version of him, trying to connect it to the man in the photo I had just seen. It was the same face, the same eyes, but something in between had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily enough that I had adjusted to it without realizing what I was losing. I moved on, back into the kitchen, where the light had changed slightly, the afternoon sun now softer, longer shadows stretching across the floor. I sat down again, this time without reaching for anything, just letting the quiet settle around me. The truth was simple. Not cruel in the way people expect cruelty to be loud and obvious. It was quieter than that, more careful. They had not refused to help me outright. They had not said no in a way that could be called unkind. They had simply chosen other things first. And in doing so, they had answered me more clearly than any words could have. I rested my hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, noticing the small details I rarely paid attention to anymore. The faint lines, the way my fingers had begun to change shape over the years. These were the same hands that had once tied Jason's shoes, that had stayed up late helping him finish school projects, that had worked extra hours without complaint so he could have things I did not. I had never kept track of those things. I had never needed to. At the time, they felt like part of a life that made sense. But now, sitting there in the quiet, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. Help, when it is given freely, for years, becomes expected. And when it is expected, it stops being seen. I picked up my phone one more time, not to scroll, not to call, but simply to hold it, to feel its weight in my hand. For a moment, I considered sending a message, something simple, something neutral. But I stopped. There was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to ask. The answer had already been given, not in words, but in choices. I set the phone down again, this time with a steadiness that felt different from before. Not heavier, not lighter, just clear. I needed help, and they had made their priorities known without ever having to say it out loud. I did not cry after that. That surprised me more than anything else. There was a time when something like this would have broken me in ways I could not hide, when I would have sat at this same table with tears I could not stop and questions I could not answer. But now, the feeling was different, quieter, more settled. It was as if something inside me had finally stopped expecting things to be the way they used to be. I stood up and walked toward the hallway again, this time slower, more deliberate, letting my fingers brush lightly against the frames on the wall as I passed. Each photograph held a version of a life I had believed would always stay connected, moments frozen in time that once felt permanent. I paused at one I had not looked at closely in years. Jason was about 10 years old, standing in the backyard, holding a small toolbox with both hands, his face serious with concentration. He had insisted on helping me fix a loose hinge on the fence that summer. The repair had taken twice as long as it should have, but I had let him take the lead, guiding him gently, watching the pride grow in his eyes when the gate finally closed properly. "I did it," he had said, looking up at me like he had just solved something much bigger than a hinge. I remember smiling and telling him he could fix anything if he just took his time. Back then, helping each other had not been a question. It had been natural, automatic. I moved away from the photo and continued down the hallway, the memory lingering longer than I expected. It was not just about what had changed now. It was about how slowly it had changed, how many small moments I had dismissed as normal, as part of life moving forward. I had told myself not to take things personally when visits became less frequent, when holidays started to feel more scheduled than shared, when conversations turned into quick updates instead of real connection. I had explained it away with reasons that sounded reasonable at the time. Work gets busy, people grow up, priorities shift, and I had accepted all of it without question, because accepting it felt easier than asking whether something deeper was being lost. I returned to the kitchen and leaned against the counter, looking out the window without really focusing on anything outside. The sky had begun to soften into late afternoon, the light no longer sharp, just steady and calm. It matched the feeling settling inside me now. Not heavy, not sharp, just clear. I thought about Lauren then, about the way she spoke, always measured, always careful. She had never been openly unkind. She had never raised her voice or said anything that could be pointed to as wrong. But there had always been a certain distance in her tone, a subtle redirection in conversations, a way of shaping plans so that they moved around me instead of including me. I had noticed it, of course, but I had chosen not to name it. I had told myself that it was just a different way of doing things, that every family finds its own rhythm. And maybe that was true. But the rhythm I had found myself in was one where I was no longer part of the center. I was something that could be adjusted around, something that could be delayed, something that could be handled later. I straightened up and walked back to the table, pulling out the chair and sitting down again, this time with a sense of purpose that had not been there earlier. The phone sat in front of me, still and silent. I did not reach for it right away. Instead, I let myself think about the pattern as a whole, not just today, not just the call or the photo, but everything leading up to this point. It was not one moment. It was a series of choices, repeated quietly over time, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together forming something undeniable. I had been stepping back for years, making space, being understanding, being patient. And somewhere along the way, that space had become a distance that no one felt the need to close. I picked up the phone slowly, turning it over in my hand, feeling its smooth surface, its familiar weight. This time, I did not look for messages or missed calls. I already knew there would be none. Instead, I opened my contacts and scrolled past Jason's name without stopping. I did not pause. I did not hesitate. I kept going, further down the list, past numbers I had not called in a long time, past names that belonged to a life that felt farther away than it should have. Then I stopped, not because I had found someone specific, but because I realized something simple and steady at the same time. If I needed help, I would have to stop looking for it in places where it no longer existed. The thought did not feel dramatic. It did not feel like a decision made in anger or hurt. It felt practical, necessary, like closing a door that had already been half shut for a long time. I set the phone back down on the table and folded my hands again, but this time there was no waiting in the gesture, no expectation tied to it, just stillness, just clarity. I needed help. And now, for the first time, I was beginning to understand that I had been asking the wrong people all along. I did not call anyone that evening. Not a friend, not a neighbor, not even out of habit. I let the house remain quiet, not as something to endure, but as something to understand. There is a difference between silence that feels empty and silence that reveals something you have been avoiding, and that night, it began to feel like the second kind. I moved through the kitchen again, slower this time, noticing details I had overlooked before, the small crack near the corner of the counter, the way the cabinet door did not close all the way unless you pressed it twice, the faint hum of the refrigerator that had always been there, but never quite this loud. It was not that the house had changed. It was that I was finally still enough to hear it clearly. I made myself a simple dinner, something easy, something I did not have to think about, and I sat at the table without turning on the television, without reaching for the phone. I just sat there, letting the quiet stretch out around me, not trying to fill it. For years, I had filled it with excuses of my own, explanations that made other people's behavior easier to accept. They are busy. They have their own lives. I should not expect too much. But sitting there now, I realized those explanations had never really been about understanding them. They had been about protecting myself from seeing what was actually happening. Because the truth, when it finally settles, is not loud. It does not arrive with an argument or a confrontation. It arrives in small realizations that leave no room for misunderstanding. I finished my meal and cleared the table, placing everything back where it belonged, my movement steady, almost deliberate. When I was done, I did not rush into the next task. I simply stood there for a moment, looking at the space I had just cleared, and felt something shift again, not in a painful way, but in a way that felt final. I walked into the living room and sat down, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my eyes drifting toward the window where the last of the daylight had begun to fade. The sky had softened into a muted gray, the kind that makes everything feel quieter than it already is. I thought about the years behind me, not in a way that searched for mistakes, but in a way that tried to understand the pattern. I had always believed that being there for someone meant that, when the time came, they would be there for you. Not because they owed you, but because that is how connection works. You give, and it builds something that holds over time. But now, I was beginning to see that not everyone carries that understanding in the same way. Some people accept what is given and move forward without ever thinking about what it means to return it. Not out of cruelty, not out of intention, but simply because it does not occur to them. And once you see that, once you truly understand it, something inside you changes. You stop waiting. You stop expecting the pattern to correct itself. I leaned back slightly, letting the chair support me, and for the first time that day, I felt something close to relief. Not because anything had improved, but because something had become clear. Clarity has a way of taking the weight out of confusion. It does not solve the situation, but it removes the question of what is really happening. And without that question, there is a different kind of quiet, one that does not ask for answers anymore. I reached for the small notebook I kept on the side table, something I had not opened in months, and I turned to a blank page. I did not write much, just a few lines. Simple things. Names, numbers, small reminders. It was not a list of what I had lost. It was a list of what I still had control over. I closed the notebook and set it back down, my hand lingering on the cover for a moment before pulling away. The phone remained on the table across the room, untouched, silent, exactly where I had left it. I did not feel the need to check it. I did not feel the need to hope that it might ring. That part of the day had passed. I stood up and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the street now dim under the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, a car door closed, a brief sound that echoed before disappearing again. Life was still moving, still happening, just not in the way I had once expected it to include me. I rested my hand lightly against the glass and let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not strained, just steady. I needed help. And now, for the first time, I was no longer asking for it where it had already been denied. That realization did not make me feel smaller. It made me feel precise. And precision, I was beginning to understand, is where change begins. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a slow shift in light that moved across the walls and settled into the corners of the house, as if it had always been there. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because something inside me had already decided the day would not be like the one before. The quiet was still there, but it no longer felt like something pressing down on me. It felt neutral, almost steady, like a blank page waiting to be used instead of something to endure. I made my way to the kitchen and prepared coffee, measuring each step without rushing, listening to the familiar sounds, the drip, the soft clink of the mug against the counter, the faint hum of the machine finishing its cycle. I sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth settle into my fingers before taking a sip. It tasted the same as always, but I noticed it differently, as if I had not truly been present for it in a long time. I did not reach for my phone. I did not check for messages. That absence, which would have felt heavy the day before, now felt expected, and because it was expected, it no longer held any power over how I began the morning. Instead, I looked around the kitchen, not as a place filled with memory, but as a space I still owned, still controlled, still understood. There was something grounding in that realization, something that reminded me that not everything had shifted out of reach. After finishing my coffee, I stood up and moved with purpose, not in a hurried way, but in a way that carried direction. I went to the small drawer near the hallway and took out a set of keys I had not used in some time. They felt slightly unfamiliar in my hand, not because they had changed, but because I had not needed them in a while. I paused for a moment, looking at them, then slipped them into my pocket. It was a small action, but it marked something clear. I was no longer waiting for someone else to step in. I was stepping forward on my own. I put on my coat and walked toward the front door, opening it slowly as the cool air met me just beyond the threshold. The morning outside was calm, the street quiet except for the occasional sound of a car passing in the distance. I stepped out and closed the door behind me, the click of the lock sounding firmer than usual, as if it carried a decision with it. As I walked down the short path toward the driveway, I noticed how steady my steps felt, not hesitant, not uncertain, just measured and clear. I reached my car and stood beside it for a moment, looking at the reflection in the window, not searching for anything, just acknowledging what was there. Then I opened the door and got in, placing my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine right away. I let the moment settle, the quiet inside the car matching the quiet I had left behind in the house. Only this time it felt contained, controlled, something I could carry with me instead of something that surrounded me. When I finally started the engine, the sound was soft but definite, a simple signal that the day had begun in a way that belonged to me. As I pulled out of the driveway and onto the street, I did not think about calling Jason. I did not think about whether he might call me later. That question no longer followed me the way it had before. Instead, my focus stayed on the road ahead, on the direction I had chosen without needing anyone else to confirm it. The houses passed by slowly, familiar but distant, each one holding its own life, its own routines, its own priorities. For the first time in a long while, I did not measure my place against any of them. I simply moved forward. The realization from the day before stayed with me, not as something heavy, but as something steady, something that shaped how I saw everything now. I needed help. And now I understood that help, when it does not come from where you expect it, does not mean it does not exist. It means you have to look for it somewhere else. And more importantly, it means you have to decide that you are capable of taking the first step without waiting for permission. As the road opened up in front of me, I felt that shift settle fully into place, not dramatic, not sudden, but complete. I was no longer standing still, hoping someone would notice. I was moving, quietly, deliberately, in a direction that no longer depended on whether anyone else chose to follow. The road led me somewhere I had not planned in detail, but that did not matter. What mattered was that I was no longer sitting still, waiting for something to change on its own. I drove for a while without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle into the space around me in a way that felt different from the silence at home. This quiet moved with me. It did not hold me in place. When I finally pulled into a small parking lot near a row of local offices, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I looked at the building ahead, simple, unremarkable, the kind of place people walk into every day without thinking much about it. But for me, this was not routine. This was a step I had not taken before, at least not like this, not with this clarity behind it. I stepped out of the car and closed the door, the sound firm but not loud, just enough to mark the transition from one moment to the next. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed how steady my pace was, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Inside, the air was cool and still, the faint scent of paper and polished surfaces lingering in the background. A receptionist looked up briefly, offering a polite nod, the kind that acknowledged my presence without asking questions. I returned it and moved forward, my attention focused not on who was around me, but on why I was there. I had spent years believing that stability came from holding things together, from maintaining connections, from adjusting myself so that others would not feel burdened. But standing there now, I understood that stability could also come from something else, from setting things in order in a way that did not depend on anyone else's willingness to participate. I took a seat when I was asked to wait, folding my hands in my lap, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. The room was quiet, a different kind of quiet than my home, structured, contained, purposeful. People came and went, each focused on their own reasons for being there. No one looked at me with expectation. No one assumed anything about me. It was a neutral space, and for the first time in a long time, that neutrality felt comforting. When my name was called, I stood and followed the direction given, stepping into an office where everything was arranged neatly, files aligned. Surfaces clear, a place where decisions were made with clarity rather than emotion. I sat down and listened as questions were asked, simple, straightforward, the kind that required honest answers without explanation or justification. And I answered them, calmly, clearly, not with the hesitation I might have felt before, not with the need to soften what I was doing, but with the understanding that this was not about anyone else anymore. This was about me taking responsibility for what I could still control. The conversation was not long, but it was enough. Enough to begin something. Enough to shift the balance in a way that did not rely on whether someone else would step in or not. When I stood to leave, I did not feel lighter or heavier. I felt aligned, as if something that had been slightly out of place for a long time had finally been set straight. I walked back through the same hallway, past the same quiet reception area, and stepped outside into the afternoon light, which had grown brighter than it had been earlier, the sky now clear and open. I paused for a moment before heading back to my car, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to recognize the moment for what it was. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet turning point. I got back into the car and sat for a second before starting the engine again, my reflection faint in the windshield, steady, composed, unchanged in appearance, but different in something less visible. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not think about explaining anything to Jason. I did not think about whether he would understand or even notice. That was no longer part of the decision. What I had done did not require his approval. It did not require his awareness. It simply existed as a fact, as a step taken in a direction that no longer depended on him. The road ahead stretched out the same way it had before, familiar and ordinary, but the way I moved along it had changed. I was no longer measuring my pace against someone else's willingness to walk beside me. I was no longer slowing down in the hope that someone might catch up. I was moving at my own pace now, guided by something quieter but far more reliable than expectation. I needed help, and now I was no longer asking for it. I was building something that did not require it. When I returned home, the house felt different, not because anything inside it had changed, but because I had. The same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet air waiting behind the door, but none of it pressed against me the way it had before. I stepped inside and closed the door gently, setting my keys down in the same place I always had. Yet the action felt more intentional now, as if I was placing something back into order rather than repeating a habit. I walked into the kitchen and paused, looking at the table where I had sat the day before, waiting, hoping, adjusting my expectations to fit someone else's priorities. That version of me felt distant now, not erased, but understood in a way that no longer held me in place. I moved through the room with quiet purpose, straightening small things, aligning objects that were already nearly perfect, not because they needed fixing, but because I wanted to feel the control in my own hands. It was a subtle shift, but a real one. I no longer needed the room to feel full. I needed it to feel mine. The phone sat where I had left it, untouched, still silent. I glanced at it briefly, not with anticipation, not with disappointment, just with acknowledgement. It had not rung. It had not needed to. Whatever answer I had been waiting for was no longer tied to whether that screen lit up or not. I walked past it without picking it up and made myself another cup of coffee, this time without hesitation, without distraction, simply completing the motion from beginning to end with full attention. The rhythm of it felt steady, grounding, something I could rely on without needing anything in return. As I sat down, I let my thoughts settle, not drifting backward the way they had before, not searching through old memories for meaning, but staying present with what had already been decided. The steps I had taken earlier that day were not dramatic, not visible to anyone else, but they had shifted something fundamental. I had moved from waiting to acting, from hoping to knowing. And once that shift happens, it cannot be undone. I looked around the room again, this time noticing not what was missing, but what remained unchanged, what still belonged entirely to me. The house was quiet, yes, but it was also stable, consistent, something that did not require negotiation or approval. I stood up and walked toward the living room, pausing briefly by the photographs on the wall. I did not linger this time. I did not trace the past with the same searching gaze. Those memories were still there, but they no longer held the same weight over my present. I turned away and continued forward, each step reinforcing the same quiet understanding. Later that afternoon, the light shifted again, casting longer shadows across the floor, marking the slow passage of time in a way that felt calm rather than empty. I sat by the window and watched as the neighborhood moved at its usual pace, people coming and going, cars pulling in and out of driveways, life continuing without interruption. There was a time when I would have measured myself against that movement, wondering where I fit within it, where I was expected to be. But now, that question had lost its urgency. I did not need to fit into someone else's rhythm anymore. I had my own. The phone remained silent through it all, a small, steady reminder of what I had already accepted. And strangely, that silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that I had seen things clearly, that I had understood the situation exactly as it was, not as I had hoped it might be. As the evening approached, I stood up once more and moved through the house, turning on a single light, then another, not to chase away the darkness, but simply to mark the transition from one part of the day to the next. Each action felt deliberate, contained, something that belonged entirely to me. I no longer needed to wait for a call to decide what came next. I no longer needed to leave space open for someone else's response. That space had been filled, not by another person, but by something steadier, by certainty. I needed help. That had been true. But now, I understood something more important. I no longer needed to ask for it in places where it would only be postponed, redirected, or quietly declined. I had already begun building something else, something that did not depend on whether anyone chose to show up. And as I stood there in the soft light of the evening, I realized that this quiet, this steady, uninterrupted space around me was no longer something I was trapped inside. It was something I had finally learned how to stand within. The phone rang the next morning. Not loud, not urgent, just a simple sound breaking through the quiet that had settled so completely into the house. I did not rush to answer it. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, standing where I was, feeling the moment unfold without reacting to it the way I would have before. When I finally walked over and picked it up, I already knew who it was. Jason's name lit up the screen, steady, familiar, unchanged. I answered calmly, bringing the phone to my ear without adjusting my tone, without preparing myself for anything. "Hey, Mom," he said, and there was something different in his voice this time, not necessarily warmer, but more attentive, as if he had just remembered something he had meant to follow up on. "I meant to call you yesterday. Things got a little hectic." I did not respond right away, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing inside me pushing to fill the silence anymore. "I saw you called," he continued. "Everything okay?" The question hung there for a moment, simple on the surface, but layered with everything that had already been answered the day before. I leaned lightly against the counter, my gaze steady, my voice even. "Yes," I said. "Everything is fine." There was a pause, shorter this time, but still there, as if he expected something more, an explanation, a request, something that would return the conversation to its usual pattern. "Did you still need help with whatever it was?" he asked, the uncertainty in his words making it clear he had not even remembered the details of the call. I let that settle for a second before answering. "No," I said just as calmly. "I took care of it." Another pause, this one longer. I could almost hear him adjusting his understanding, trying to place this response into a pattern that no longer fit. "Oh," he said. "Well, that is good." His voice shifted slightly, not uncomfortable, but searching. "You could have waited. I would have figured something out." I looked down at the counter, at the faint lines in the surface that I had traced so many times without noticing, and for the first time, the words did not land the way they used to. There was no relief in them, no reassurance, just a quiet recognition of how easily they were said. "I know," I replied. And I did know. I knew he believed that in his own way. I knew he thought that saying it was enough, but understanding that no longer required me to accept it. "Anyway," he continued, his tone lightening slightly, "we should get together soon. It has been a while." I straightened up, shifting my weight just enough to feel grounded in the moment. "Maybe," I said, not committing, not dismissing, just leaving the word where it was. Another small pause followed, and this time, he did not try to fill it immediately. "Okay," he said finally. "Just let me know." "I will," I answered, knowing that whether I did or not was no longer something I felt obligated to decide in that moment. We ended the call shortly after, the conversation closing without tension, without conflict, just a quiet separation of expectations that no longer aligned the way they once had. I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment, not replaying the conversation, not analyzing it, just letting it exist as it was. Nothing dramatic had been said. Nothing needed to be. The difference was not in the words. It was in the space between them. I walked back to the table and sat down, placing my hands lightly in front of me, feeling the same steady calm that had been building since the day before. The house was quiet again, but this time, it did not feel like something waiting to be filled. It felt complete on its own. I looked around the room, at the same details, the same familiar surroundings, and understood something clearly, something that did not need to be repeated or emphasized. I had needed help. That had been true. But what mattered now was not that it had not come. What mattered was that I had stopped waiting for it. The call had come too, just as it always eventually did. But this time, it had arrived after something had already changed, after the need for it had passed. And standing there in that quiet, steady space, I realized that this was the difference. Not whether they showed up, not whether they called, but whether I was still standing in the same place, waiting for them to do it. And for the first time, I was not.